Good afternoon. Yesterday we ended the discussion with the topic indigenous peoples, and I would like to come back to that because thanks to new SAO researcher Aurora Perez here present, I have had the privilege to be part of many discussions in the 1980s that eventually led up to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples accepted by and adopted by the UN Assembly in 2007. So I liked very much your focus on that important document, and I would like to add a couple of observations about the terminology as well. First of all, I think we should not separate the words indigenous and peoples. I think they belong together. And then we should also not forget that the term indigenous peoples was not coined to categorize peoples. In fact, the UN never went as far as actually producing some type of definition who or what indigenous peoples officially are. It is very clear that the term is used to refer to a problem within the field of human rights. The term comes obviously from a colonial vocabulary, and it is used consciously to denounce the ongoing structures of injustice provoked by colonialism and to refer to peoples who suffer from that situation. So I'm Dutch. I may say by the dictionary that I am indigenous Dutch. I'm a native Dutch, but I am not someone who belongs to one of the indigenous peoples. And that is where the whole crux of the matter is. I also think that the rights of indigenous peoples, as defined by the UN, are not special to indigenous peoples. As is the case in all human rights discussions, we all have those rights. It's not that indigenous peoples were so successful that those rights were recognized. No, we all have those rights. The whole idea of having a special declaration is noticing that there are parts in the world where those rights are not materializing and not being implemented. And that the UN has done, and putting on it the label indigenous peoples in retrospect. One may say, well, maybe in the 1980s not everything was considered, and maybe in retrospect the term indigenous is not the most comprehensive one for the problem, but still at least we have a label to recognize a problem. And in fact, what the UN did, or what indigenous peoples representatives and state parties within the UN framework did, is that the declaration itself formulates the problem. No? So we may read, for example, Article 3, indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, also in another way. Indigenous peoples are those peoples that do not yet have self-determination. And in this way, the whole declaration is one description of the problem and of indigenous peoples, as far as recognized so far by state parties. So we have a lot of things there, no? Subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture, forcibly removed from their lands or territories, not being able to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, not being allowed to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, etc., etc. All of these elements define who indigenous peoples are. You go to a country, you see that different languages are spoken, and you find that certain languages are not taught at school, and they hang together with discrimination of a particular people that speak that language. There we have indigenous peoples. So strangely enough, one may say that in present-day Europe, a lot of migrant populations are actually indigenous peoples. But we knew that all the time, didn't we? One of the parts of indigenous peoples today is that also they are not living in the place where they were. Aurora is a Mixtec. Mixtec are 500,000 people. Of that 500,000 people, about 1/4 lives in the Los Angeles area in the US as migrants. Are they indigenous? Well, they are an indigenous people. but they are not indigenous to the LA area. No? So this is what I think that we should really look at, and that should also be in our mind at the moment we try to solve these matters along legal ways. Because we are talking about rights that we all as humans have, and trying to argue if one is an indigenous person and therefore entitled to a specific right will simply not work. So in this context, we are confronted then with the articles in the declaration that say, well, indigenous peoples have the right to redress, restitution, compensation, etc., and even the prescription that states shall seek to enable the access and repatriation of ceremonial objects, human remains, etc. Well, that should be done. The right is there. The problem is not if the right is there or if it is well formulated. The right is clear enough. The practicing the right, the implementation of the declaration is the issue. And I must say, I feel always very disheartened when I listen to the legal view on this, where lawyers then will immediately start saying, didn't happen yesterday, fortunately, but in other occasions it does that, well, the declaration is not legally binding. It's not legally binding. I think, what are we talking about? This is not a legal matter. This is about human rights. This is the most binding thing there is. Everything outside this is an anti-human criminal. And we should state that and keep stating it, because in human rights issues, we are not going to win anything with letters of the law written by dominant people. We can only mobilize the shame of those who oppress others. And therefore we have to keep saying the things that we are saying. A comment on the redress. I think it came out already quite clearly in the different presentations here, also of the person speaking before me. This is not only about objects. Objects are important. Beings are important. But it is also about everything that goes with it. The memories, the participations, the interpretations, etc., etc., and the non-participation, generally speaking, of indigenous peoples in that whole discourse. Being more familiar with the situation in Mexico than that in the United States, I must say I see a very bleak panorama in which there are leading institutions, academia, and museums alike, in which the discourse about indigenous cultures and indigenous peoples is in the hand and in the mouth of others, not of the indigenous peoples themselves. There are about 16 million people that are counted as indigenous peoples in Mexico, belonging to those indigenous peoples, over 60 different indigenous peoples. And their culture is not in their hands. What is there is a widely distributed idea of a discriminatory nature, saying that indigenous peoples are not capable of handling their own stuff, that the state should take care of these poor, pitiful people, and the general idea that they in some way or another belong to the past. They have no future as such. What Fabian has called so aptly the denial of co-evilness. And indigenous people then become informants, props, maybe some scapegoats or excuses for what others are doing, and outsiders associated with the dominant powers of the West are dominating the investigations, the studies, and nowadays we are entering a phase. It's a step forward, but still far removed from the result. We are entering a phase in which indigenous people sometimes are going to be asked about their opinion or consent. Do not know very many examples of it, but sometimes that happens, or seems to happen. Certainly in the United States, that development is further developed, but still I must say that although indigenous peoples are more present, although they have constitutional presence and rights in terms of NACPRA, etc., still exhibits are very much contextualized by the effect that it is directed to a public, and that public generally is an other group looking at indigenous peoples as an object. And that creates a great difficulty in really establishing dialogue, doesn't it? In the case of Mexico, we can say that exhibits are precisely calling our attention for everything that they are not saying. We have beautiful presentations of archaeological treasures, of ethnographic splendor, etc., but we have no attention to the massacres, the killings, the violence, etc., that are going on in that country. And we see that, especially the effect of that, in foreign countries, like in Holland or elsewhere in Europe, where the Mexican embassies will generally support, favor Mexican nice, spectacular events, such as the Day of the Dead and having a nice altar and so on and so forth, because it helps to take away the attention of the public to the fact that there are 100,000 people killed in the past 10 years by all kinds of violences going on, in which the Mexican authorities themselves are in one way or another implicated. So I think that we are looking at a heritage and a culture that has been expropriated out of the hands of the people themselves. And when we talk about redress, that other part should be taken into account as well. And the main thing there is that we should guarantee the presence, the participation, active co-designing of indigenous peoples, and from a leading position. That is, people that will have the degrees, the authorities, and the knowledge about different worlds, their own world and the world that their world is looked upon, both in order to really have their own say in what is being presented in books, in exhibits, and what is going to be done with the beings that are in the collections. This sounds like hopelessly idealistic, but I must say I have had the fortune in the past years to work together in the framework of an ERC advanced grant with a number of indigenous PhD candidates and colleagues. And I must say it is such a wonderful, original, innovative experience to work together and to achieve better understanding of what ancient art, for example, is about and how it can relate immediately to concerns of the present. And I hope this is what, as an academic community, we can be doing much more, because it may be very difficult and out of the academic hands to really change complex social structures of oppression in faraway countries. But we certainly can change academic practice. We can do that right now. Thank you very much.